Okay, welcome to this short presentation on really what it says in the title, which is how to read a scientific paper. I'm going to show you 10 simple rules. And it is something that we all come across, which is, well, I'm presented with a paper. So, for example, paper like this, and you're either reading it because you need to read it because you've got a study to do, or you're reading it because, for example, you maybe have an assessment on it, or you're reading it because you are doing a literature review for a major piece of work. But how do you get the information out of this? What is it that you should be doing? Because you read a paper and you look at the paper and think, gosh, there's an awful lot of information in here. And you scroll down and you get into a methods section. And then we start to get into kind of information that's provided. And then the bit that I think for many people that really scares us is when we get into, say, the results section, you suddenly start to see all this data and all this information that's provided. And then we get kind of graphical interpretation. It becomes very, very difficult to kind of follow the argument and actually understand what on earth am I meant to do with this information. So hopefully with these rules, you'll find it an easier way to get into this. It's not a quick fix. Let me be absolutely clear. You still have to read and you still have to put the work in. But I think if you understand kind of this process, it'll become a little bit easier in terms of getting going. And then really beyond the getting going, it's the hard work that you have to put in to keep that process going all along. So let's start with rule one. And rule one is kind of, let's set this in context. It is, well, what do you want to get out of the article? So you need to understand what it is you want to use it for. So for example, you might be an undergraduate student, maybe in your first year, even your second year of studies, and you're new to reading scientific papers, or maybe you're coming to science quite late. Okay, that's your approach, but that is different to somebody who might be entering a new field, and to a certain degree these overlap. But you might be, say, as an example, you might be an exercise physiologist who has come across some material that's in biomechanics, so you're new to the biomechanics field. So you're entering a new field, and then you want to learn what is important in that field. But you can see how they overlap in terms of kind of these principles. The third principle may be something perhaps a bit more akin if you're maybe a more senior researcher in terms of maybe moving into postgraduate study. And we can get automated alerts from journals. Very, very useful thing to do because they update you every time papers are published. And so you've perhaps got this particular author whose work inspires you. So you're looking to kind of follow this author and you're kind of looking to understand a little bit more about what it is that they are doing. It might be that your goal is that you're fundamentally getting updates on literature that is coming through based upon keywords. And you can set these up. So for example, through Google Scholar, as a simple example, you can set your account up with Google Scholar and say, well, I want alerts when papers are published with these keywords. Brilliant. So for example, I get papers under the keywords of, I'll give you an example, glycogen depletion. Okay, because I'm relatively interested in glycogen depletion. I get updates on those papers when they are being published. But that's different to the goal, which is something we tend to do maybe as more senior academics, but also something you will do if you're a postgraduate is when you're reviewing an article prior to maybe its publication and writing it. But they're all different goals. So you need to know what it is you're doing. But as an undergraduate, if you're watching this as an undergrad, then really it's rule one and rule two that become very, very important. Or rule one part one, rule one part two that become very important. Which brings us into rule two. And rule two is quite important. I think it's the one thing that we often overlook as anybody that's reading these papers. So you've identified your original goal. So we're an undergraduate student as an example, and we're new to the scientific literature. Okay. Now think about what was the author's goal. Why did they do this work? Because that's going to help you understand what their interpretation was of the data. And to do this, it does mean you have to do a little bit of work sometimes. So it's worth just Googling. Find out who the authors were. What's their background? What's their experience? Because actually that brings some information to the table. Simply reading a paper and not knowing anything about the authors, it's kind of like a disconnect. It would be like reading, I don't know, I'm going to give you an example. Let's use the example of, say, reading Harry Potter, but we're not knowing anything about the author. Now knowing something maybe about the author, it may have put you off reading Harry Potter, okay, as an example, or vice versa. But knowing something about the author brings to the table kind of, well, what's their interest? Are they specialists in this area? Is this something that they're new to? Are they a postgraduate student? So is this kind of the new piece of work from postgraduate? All of this helps in terms of understanding where the person who's writing the paper was coming from. And it does mean you've got to do a little bit of work. But don't be discouraged, because actually fundamentally, by doing reading, it's kind of gaining the experience. And so the more you read, the more experienced you become at this process, the more you'll start to see names that reappear. You'll start to be able to make connections. You have to, if you're, it doesn't matter what discipline you're studying or working within, you have to read. Okay, that's how we get knowledge. You don't get knowledge from simply just looking at, say, Twitter feeds or TikTok or Instagram, because they're kind of distilled down. They're quite useful, but they don't give you the full kind of context. So you kind of have to do the reading. It's very, very important. Then the next thing to think about is, well, what kind of article is it I'm dealing with? Because journals publish very different kinds of articles. You get what are called methods papers. You get reviews, you might get commentaries, you might get what are resource papers, you might get research papers. And understanding what kind of paper it is you're reading fundamentally helps you understand what the expectations are for the context of the paper and what's going in that paper. So always start with, what kind of paper am I reading? Am I reading a review? Am I reading a research article, which perhaps the most common ones that most undergraduates will come across? Let me show you a difference between those to kind of set this up for you. So this paper here that we saw right at the start of this short presentation, this is a research article. And we know it's a research article because they're kind of setting out for it. It says here it's article, and they're telling us what the title of the study is. And we can see if we go through, there's an introduction, there's some materials and methods, but we get, as we would expect to have in this kind of paper, we get to our empirical data. We've got a results section and so on. Now, if I compare that to a review paper, so this is another one from our group, it's one of our PhD students. This is why understanding who the writers are is quite important. They've told you it's a systematic review. Now, sometimes they may not tell you it's a review paper, but they've told us it's a systematic review. But again, it's got an introduction. Very similar. It's got a methods section. And then we have a results section. But you'll notice the results section in this kind of paper is quite different in terms of the way the results are presented to us. And then if we look at this example here, this is also a review. Notice they don't tell you it's a review. Okay? So what you start to get into is you can start to see its review, because notice there is no introduction here. There is no method. This is quite simply what we call a narrative review. Very different to kind of the systematic review you saw in the previous paper. So understanding the kind of paper that you're reviewing is really important in terms of understanding kind of what information is going to be coming across. In a research article, it will be data collected from that author. In a systematic review, so for example, like this one here, this is where a load of studies have been put together, lots and lots of studies have been compiled, and what the authors are doing is then comparing and contrasting those studies to draw best conclusions. In a narrative review, such as this one, the authors are, in essence, almost telling a story. This one's actually a historical perspective, but they're telling a story to kind of give a very broad representation of the literature. Which brings us on to kind of a little bit more information about Rule 2. So just to remind you, a methods paper will present a new technique. A review article will summarize a field or a problem. A commentary is going to take a stand. It's kind of an argument that is made. And quite often with commentaries, you get the original commentary, and then you might get a counter paper to that. It might be a resource article that presents a new tool or a new data set that anybody else can use. And then a research article, and that's presenting new data. And also in a research article, It's the author's interpretation of those data. In the others, they are not an interpretation of data. That's a real distinction. Now, rule 3, I think, is fundamentally the most important rule to remember. And if you kind of follow this, I think actually reading papers becomes much, much easier. So, rule 1, ask yourself this. What do the authors want to know? What was their motivation? What was their aim for their study? What was their hypothesis? Rule 2, what did they do? What were their approaches? What were their methods? How did they go about meeting their motivation, meeting their aims? Rule 3, why was it done? What was the rationale for the study? And you'll always find the rationale, certainly in the introduction, but also in the discussion, particularly if it's a more empirical research study. Rule 4, well, what did the results show? And don't simply just look at the words. Actually go and read the tables and the figures, and I'll show you a little bit more on that in a moment. How did they interpret the results? So that's the discussion and the conclusions. What did they take from their results? And then, really important one, what should be done next? So what I would say with this one is okay, so where does future work go? But ask yourself, where do you think the future work should go? So rather than just reading that straight away, where do you think the work should go? So what you need to do is ask all of these, and they can and should be asked about the complete work. And you should ask that about each table and each figure. And it sounds like a lot of work, but fundamentally there is no way of kind of sugarcoating it. To read a paper, to understand a paper, takes time, takes work. And it's not a case of thinking, well, if this is a grumpy old man talking about how to read a paper, and I'm just a new undergraduate. Surely it's much easier as you get more senior. Not necessarily. I still have to read papers, as we're going to talk about in a moment, multiple times to get the context. Papers are not necessarily the easiest things to read. You have to invest time to understand something. So, as I've written here, it can take a long time to read one article. And it is intimidating. So break it down. So let me give you an example. Let's take this paper here. So you've been asked to review this paper. It's a really long paper. I mean, look, there's pages and pages and pages and pages of information here, right? You've been asked to read it. So what you should do is break it down in relation to the rules. So let's go back to our rules. Rule 1, what did the authors want to know? So we go into the introduction and we read the introduction. And what you want to do is go, okay, can I summarize what is it they wanted to know? And we can probably get to it here where they go, well, actually, if we scroll down a little bit, so we've got a bit about Down syndrome population here. So if I just zoom in a bit, make it easier for us all to read, maybe that might help. Okay, there we go. The mindset study was conducted to examine if applying a prescribed exercise regime in the form of an 8-week intervention could positively affect the cognitive, executive, and physical health of adults with Down syndrome. It is hypothesized that walking will promote, so they're telling you what they wanted to do. Then we go, okay, we go to, well, what did they do? So you've summarized the introduction, take a pause, don't try and crash through, now go to the materials and methods. What did they do? How many participants? What was their study design? How many groups did they have? What equipment did they use? What was their method? Then go to, okay, why was it done that way? So they may well explain the approach that they took. Why did they use, in this example here, why did they use repeated measures, match pairs, group design? Well, they may not tell you that. This is where you may have to do reading around. You may have to think, well, why would they have done it that way? Why not do it another way? And this is where you have to take on the role of being a little bit of an investigator. Okay? Do not assume that the paper is going to tell you everything. A paper is a summary. Okay? Papers are limited in the number of words that authors are allowed to use. So they're not going to be able to afford to tell you everything. So you have to kind of go behind the information to work some of these things out. What do the results show? Well, within the results, again, don't go crashing in thinking, oh gosh, this is going to be really difficult to do. Break it down. So go, okay, Start maybe with the simple stuff. Go with the tables of information. What do the tables show us? Well, they tell us here, for example, the time that they spent sitting or reclining. So we've got basic information. So don't think you've got to go into all the really hard statistics straight away. Maybe look at the graphs straight away. What do the graphs tell us? Because I think quite often you will look at the statistics, go, this is impenetrable, I don't understand what's going on. Start with the easier information first. Okay, then how did they interpret the results? Well, go into the discussion and you'll start to get a sense of how they may have interpreted the results. Because all papers kind of follow a very similar format. They'll remind us, again, what the purpose of the study was, what they hypothesis, and they tell us, really, fundamentally, this is great, the findings allow for the acceptance of the hypothesis. So they're telling us why they accepted it, and then they're going to explain to you why they accepted it. So just follow the argument through and break it down. Don't try and read the whole thing in one go. Read a section and think about summarizing it. Read a section, summarize it. Okay? And then what should be done next? Well, the authors, to a certain degree, may well have put that in. Most papers ask authors to kind of give a summary of where they think the work should go. So, for example, here, in the Down syndrome population, it is known about how exercise intensity drives biological responses, and crucially, the cognitive development observed in this study could be heightened through exercise, which is more intense. It is also recommended that future work should apply interventions beyond 8 weeks. So they're kind of giving you that, but you may want to think for yourself, what could they do next with this kind of work? So you have to do that for each section and almost each kind of image within the paper. So rule 3 is so important. And I cannot say this enough. Do not assume that simply just reading a paper that the information goes in. It doesn't. It's not the way we work. Nobody really, unless you've got a photographic memory, absorbs information like that. You have to invest time to understand what is going on. So now we come to rule 4. And this is the data and the bit that scares people. But actually, it's the bit that's probably the most fun to work with, because you can start to think about the figures. So for each figure, well, okay, what are they doing on the X and the Y axis? Why have they used a particular colour scheme? So some papers will have used colour schemes. So let's have a look. So if we take this paper here, this is quite a neat one to work with. So the authors in here, our group, have given us these stacked columns here. So we've got our x-axis. Okay, well, the x-axis is the group. What's the y-axis? Well, it's the percentage of total responses. What are the colours? And they're telling you, so the colours are really important. They're helping you to interpret the information. So help yourself by kind of starting with the tables and the figures. Okay, why did they use a particular plotting approach? Think about in the tables. What were the groups? What variables have they presented? Okay, and don't forget, always read these legends, because they're explaining to you, look, you're reading this going, God, there's lots going on here, I don't understand this. And they've written down here, so they've written here, for all participants combined, total and split groups, positive significant interactions from chi-square analysis are highlighted with this hash. So this is telling us that there are positive significant interactions between all the groups in this data, So straight away, they're informing you. But notice here, there isn't a positive interaction against this group here, which is the control group. So just simply reading that information below the table or below the figure helps you start to understand what is going on. Don't ignore it. It's there for a reason. Okay? And the other thing is, don't be afraid to go back to the methods section. Because you've got to remember, sometimes it will help you understand why they're presenting the data the way they are. And it is a case of maybe just reminding yourself, and this may be an idea, as we'll get to a later rule, in terms of the way in which you take notes. Which brings us on to rule 5. And rule 5 is perhaps not as important as certainly rule 3 and 4, particularly if you're an undergraduate. So just remember that some sections in papers are written to be objective descriptions of the data, so the results section, and some are meant to be a slightly more, perhaps more subjective. So that might be where they interpret the data. So you just have to remember that if you're reading a discussion, it's the author's interpretation of their data. And we'll come back to that in a moment because it's really important. It doesn't mean it's hard and fast. And this explains why we get differences of opinion. Because in science, we cannot prove anything. It's about demonstrating arguments or presenting arguments, and it's allowing us to kind of make interpretations of those arguments ourselves. So rule 6, which connects, and this is really important. Published papers are not truths etched in stone. Published papers in high impact journals are not truths etched in stone. Published papers by bigwigs in the field are not truths etched in stone. Published papers that seem to agree with your own hypothesis or data are not etched in stone. Published papers that seem to refute your hypothesis or data are not etched in stone. So in other words, don't take a paper at face value. Just because something's been written, you have to critically evaluate it. And that is hard. Okay? Critical thinking and critical skills are hard, but they can be learned. And you have to evaluate the data, and you have to minimize bias. So you have to read it with kind of a very clear perspective. You have to follow those rules. Rule 3, 1 to kind of 5. 1 to 6. Why did the authors do what they did? How did they do it? What did they find? What are their interpretations? Where are they going to go next? So it's really important that you understand that just because it's published doesn't mean that the paper is set in stone, that the theory is set in stone, that the findings cannot be refuted. That's the beauty of science, that science is there to be challenged. So rule 7, really, really, really important. I think this is perhaps you've got rule 3 and rule 4. I think this is the next most important rule. Perhaps I should have put them in that order, but here we go. I would say this. You may well need to look up a term. So I'm going to show you an example. So if we go to this paper here, I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to skirt around a little bit and see if we can find a phrase that may be a little bit more problematic to some of us. So if we go down and say, okay, let's say that you're not sure what, it's an easy one, but we're not sure what oxygen uptake means, okay? Okay, you don't know what it means, or you don't know, for example, they refer to hyperbolic. You don't know what hyperbolic means. You need to go and read up on it. Use a dictionary, online dictionary. Go and read another paper. Go and look at other authors. If you do not understand words or you don't understand statements and you don't engage with those to actually address that lack of understanding, then none of it will make sense. None of it. I'm quite seasoned as an academic. So I've been in academia for 25, 26 years. I still use a dictionary to understand stuff when I read a paper that I'm not entirely in a field that perhaps I'm not used to. So if I go and read a medical paper, I'll be coming across medical terms, or a genetics paper. I'll be coming across terms I've never really understood. I've never seen before. Of course I'll use a dictionary. Do not be frightened to use resources. But it takes time. You cannot assume that you're going to just open up the paper and the information is going to go in and bing, I understand it all. It doesn't work like that. You have to invest time. And what I would say is you need to read an article 3 times. 3 times. So the first time, simply read it. No pressure of understanding or critiquing. Just read it. Okay? Just go through it. You may want to take a break in a second, but just go through it. Second time, reread it, but now try to understand the paper. The first time you're just reading it, and actually some information will go in, some won't. Second time you're trying to understand it. And that one here is where you may well now have to go back and go, right, I don't understand this section. Right, I've got to understand what this word means. I've got to understand what they're kind of getting at here in this argument. And then the third time, take notes. Take notes. Again, it's like going into a lecture, it's like having a tutorial, it's like going to any meeting. If you don't take notes, how do you know what information you need? So taking notes is absolutely crucial to what we do. So you have to do that with a paper. But don't do that straight away, because you're taking notes the first time without understanding what it is you're reading. And how you do that depends on the way you work. Some people like to print papers out. I like to print papers out quite often. Some people don't. Some people like to highlight stuff. So in this paper here, as an example, scroll down, I started highlighting sections in the paper which were related to a particular concept that I was interested in, which is called the W prime. Notice I haven't highlighted anything else. It's here, but you can highlight bits in different colours. Let's say you're reading a paper and there are sections which are to do with, say, I don't know, psychology. Right, I'll highlight this in orange. There's sections which are to do with physiology. I'll highlight this in green. So highlight the stuff that you need to know in maybe different colours. So that brings us then to rule 8. Big one. One I would challenge you all to do, particularly as undergraduates. If you're a postgraduate, I think this is kind of part of the course. You may be in a journal club or whatever. But talk about an article. Chat with peers. Chat with people in your group. You've read the paper, get in a little group. What do you think the paper means? Can you explain? Talk about it, because what we understand is this. You become a teacher doing that. And it's one of the best ways to learn. If you're trying to explain it to another person, it's a fantastic way of learning what it is. And by doing that, you start to understand your gaps in your knowledge. You know what your knowledge is, but you'll also perhaps see where there are gaps. Other ways of doing this, it could be, you can try and describe a paper on Twitter or on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. But somehow you're educating people. You're finding a way of imparting that knowledge. If all you do is read it, then yes, you've got the notes on it, but actually, if you get into that peer learning approach, you're helping each other to learn, and actually you're finding out where each other's gaps are, and you're actually becoming a much, much more collaborative scientist, which is what you need to be. And that brings us on to rule 9. And again, rule 9, it's not so much about the article, but what I say is it's quite important. How does it connect to other ideas described in other papers? How can I connect it to kind of my own hypothesis, my own thoughts, my own ideas? How does it connect to what I've learnt in the classroom or I've learnt in the lab? How does it help me develop as a researcher? So that's just something to think about, and that will become more apparent the more you read. And then rule 10, final one, not so important for an undergraduate student, but please, if you're postgraduate or moving into postdoc, please bear this in mind. The authors are human too. So wherever possible, do give them the benefit of the doubt. People make mistakes. I know that the very first paper I ever published has got a glaring mistake in it. Now, I've read it. When I add up all the data in terms of the macronutrients, it comes to 104%. It's there. It got published. A mistake was made. Okay. In today's society, we're very much kind of very keen on criticizing people publicly. Don't do that. Okay. Absolutely provide a critique, particularly if you're reviewing a paper. Provide a critique, but a critique which is kind of supportive, constructive, supportive. It can be difficult to read as the author, but it's useful. If it's rude, if it's brusque, it's mean-spirited, it benefits nobody. Okay? So hopefully those 10 rules are useful. If you want to know more, these 10 rules, I took these from this original paper, very, very useful paper published in PLOS Computational Biology. Very, very useful. So hopefully these 10 rules have been useful and give you an idea now a little bit more about how to read a paper. Going beyond this, all of your institutional libraries will have resources to help you in terms of guiding you a little bit more. And if you're still stuck, get yourself into a peer group, speak to your tutors, speak to your advisors.